Hello, is that better? All right, is that okay? Right, this means I can't move. Start spreading the news. All right, so let's do this. How many of you are econ students? How many of you at least taken basic sort of macro 101, all that sort of stuff? Good, that means I don't need to explain everything that follows. Let's go. So I got annoyed enough to write a book, and it's a really good way of doing research. If any of your PhD students are thinking about doing a PhD, people sit in my office and go, what am I going to write about? And I usually say, try and find something that annoys the crap out of you, because then you'll never get fed up. And what annoys the crap out of me is the idea that when you have a global banking crisis, the solution to it is to cut the government's budget. Yeah, let's think about that for a minute, right? You have a global over-leveraging crisis of epic proportions, and the solution is, if Greek pensioners have less, that'll help. There's a long way from there to there, isn't there? Let's see how we got there. So, why would anyone think that the solution to a banking crisis is to cut government spending? Especially when this happens. So this is basically Eurozone debt to GDP. As you can see, that orgy of public spending that we had to correct for going into the crisis was in fact a reduction of public spending going into the crisis. The reason the amplitude goes so high in 2007 is because the automatic stabilizers kick in, the planet falls off its axis because of the financial crisis. And then what's meant to happen is once you start doing virtuous fiscal consolidation, the debt's meant to level off, but it doesn't, it keeps increasing. Why? Because if you have a bunch of countries that are all each other's major trading partners, they all share the same currency and therefore the same unit of account, unit of exchange and store of value, but none of them get to print it, and they all try to save at once, then arithmetically somebody isn't spending. And if somebody isn't spending and everybody's over-saving, you have to have GDP contraction on the zero lower bound. That's what happened. So if you think of the economy as a sum, a very simple arithmetic sum, and you put the debt on the top and you put the economy on the bottom, let's start with 100 to 100. Let's say that you're a big European state with 100% debt to GDP. And you decide that the best thing you could do is to incentivize business to get us out of this recovery is by making them spend more on investment. And of course, most people, yourselves included, lie awake at night worrying about the yield on the 10-year bond of your national government. You don't worry about the fact that your wife's about to lose her job or you're about to get your mortgage taken from you. You worry about spreads, because that's what the models tell you. So you're worrying about spreads, and you think, if only the government would cut welfare spending. Because if they were to seriously cut welfare spending, because in the sum, government spending is 40% of GDP, imagine that they cut spending by 50%. That would mean, calculating with my rational expectations, my lifetime's income all the way out to the end of my life, and then counting against the taxes I will no longer pay because of this credible commitment to cut the size of the state, that I actually have much more money now than I thought I did this morning until I realized that this commitment was credible to cut the state. Now that it is, I will pay so much less tax that in real terms I have so much more money now, we will all run out to IKEA and buy a couch, thus curing the recession before it happens. That's actually how the model works, folks. That's the confidence fairy. It's bollocks. Nobody thinks like that. Nothing works like that. What actually happens is when you whack huge bits of GDP off the public sector's balance sheet, the GDP shrinks, and the constant stock of debt gets bigger rather than smaller. So all those countries that shrunk their GDP ended up with more debts rather than less, despite the fact that they weren't spending any more. Et voila. Now, what's really behind this? This is the greatest moral hazard trade in human history. And I love being in France to talk about this because your banks were right at the center of this. So here's the story that everybody likes to tell about the euro. Back in the day, that red line is Greek debt. You got 25% for just holding a Greek 10-year. Wow. Now, if you go to the bank just now and put your money in a savings account, how much do you get? -3 in real terms. So that's amazing, right? But those other lines, they're like, Ireland, Slovenia, France is over there. Look, you're getting 15% for holding France in the early 1990s. I mean, was the default probability that high? Probably not, but at least the bonds were priced in the sense that it was pricing in exchange rate risk and inflation risk. Now, when you announce in 1992 that you're going to have this thing called the euro, you have just told everyone that you're going to turn over all those printing presses to the Germans. And they don't like inflation. So inflation has just been taken off the table, and you don't have your own currency now, so exchange rate risk has just disappeared. So voila, number two, those prices are going to converge. And over time, the more credible the commitment becomes and the more you see the ECB is going to only care about inflation and so on and so forth, these bonds will converge and everybody ends up with the same, basically the same interest rate as Germany. And that's what happened, right? No, that's not what happened at all. It's a really nice story. Here's what actually happened. If you were a French banker in 1990, Greek bonds are thinly traded, but you got 25% for holding them. You got 15% for holding French debt. How difficult is your job in terms of making money? But this euro thing's going to come along and screw it all up. So how do you make money on a declining spread? You use what's called a volume convergence trade. You basically buy as much as the stuff you can at the same time as taking on as much debt as you can to amplify the leverage. And over that period, the balance sheets of your big European banks, particularly French banks, we could name names, but we'll get to that later, got really, really big. To this point that some of them are 100% of French GDP. And the French government just gave its printing press to a bunch of guys living in Germany, which means if those banks get into trouble, there's no one to bail them out, except the guys who have now got the printing press, and they're Germans, and they're not going to do it. So that was called credibility. It was also called stupidity. Because it was inevitable that banks that were running operational leverage of 50 to 1 on an average Tuesday, which meant a 3% turn against their capital base would effectively render them insolvent, would eventually get into trouble. To think about how we didn't think that would happen, are any Brits here? No Brits? That's good. Anyway, if there were some Brits, there's a quasi-Brit at the back. We had a bank called Northern Rock. This was Northern Rock's business model. I will borrow overnight on what's called a short-term repo market, and then lend out for 30 years. So I'm borrowing 24 hours to lend 30 years, and I'm renewing those loans every single night for 30 years. I'm making an infinite bet on perfect capital market liquidity. You're an idiot. You should have your banking license revoked. So we built a system that was both too big to bail and too big to fail. That's why it did this. Now, everybody's got the same interest rate until the crisis hits. And then, whoops, the Greeks start going up. Why? Well, notice there's actually a bump before the Greeks start going up. In fact, the yields started to spread apart a year before the Greek crisis. Well, why was that? Well, this goes back to the ECB, because the ECB, it turns out, until Draghi actually took over, wasn't really a central bank. It was more accurately thought of as a currency board with an inflation target. Because in 2011, in the midst of a structural deflation and banking crisis, it raised interest rates twice, which makes no sense whatsoever. But that was its mission, to fight inflation, regardless of the economic conditions around. And it had a constitution to make sure that's the only thing it thought it could do. So you have a liquidity problem in a banking system that's run out of liquidity, and you have a central bank that doesn't think it's a central bank. What do you think's going to happen? Strangely, I have a slide that covers that. And here's what happened. So here's France. This is the percentage equivalent of GDP of assets from Portugal, Ireland, Greece, Spain, the eponymous pigs, that's held by French banks in the middle of 2011. Equivalent to 1/3 of French GDP. Now, if you're running a bank with 50 to 1 op leverage on an average Tuesday, and you've got that much crappy assets that the market is pricing to infinity and beyond, and you have to sell them in an emergency, what just happens to your funding structure? You just went bankrupt. And so did the Netherlands, and so did Portugal, and so did Germany. So what was everybody doing in 2010 and 2011? They were pricing in contagion risk for the entire European bond market. Because if you go back to here, whoops, people got fooled into thinking in the middle bit there that these were international bonds. They were de facto European bonds. But once Draghi had actually said, we're kind of a fake central bank, we're really not going to backstop the bond market, everybody went, what the hell am I holding? And then they started to price it nationally. So when the Greeks came out and said, it turns out we've been screwing the books, everybody freaks out. Because if you're running op lever 50 to 1 on an average Tuesday, you only have to have a handful of Greek assets. It's not going to impair your balance sheet directly, but imagine you've got this incredibly levered portfolio. Greece goes to zero. You've got the same assets as me. I've got the same assets as you. You've got the same hedges as me. We've all got the same thing in the giant super portfolio of risk. So let's say Greece goes to zero. How do you protect yourself if you're super levered? You sell Ireland. And if I know you're going to sell Ireland before I sell Ireland, what should I do? Sell Ireland. And if you know I'm going to sell Ireland, I'm going to sell Portugal. And once you run through the three of them, where do you get to? Spain. And Spain is too big to sell. If that volume of contracts hit the market at one point, the whole thing goes bang. So you had to stop contagion risk. Now, there's two ways of doing this. The Brits and the Americans did it one way, which is shower the banking system with gold. It may be iniquitous, it may be uxorious, it may be ridiculous, but it works. So they basically pumped huge amounts of money in. The New Deal model in the US was bail, fail, send to jail. The one we had in 2008, 2009 was bail, maybe fail one or two, nobody goes to jail, please start lending again, right? That was kind of the new model. We didn't even get that far in Europe, because we didn't have a central bank that realized it was a lender of last resort. So remember all those Merkozy summits? All those 20 meetings that did nothing except make people in the markets go, what the are these people doing? And the yields went up and up and up and up. And none of this changed until 2012, when Draghi came in and said, can we please be a real central bank? Now, moving beyond this, this is France. There's French GDP. There's French bank assets. There's your top three banks in 2012. What would happen if any one of those banks really went bankrupt? It would eviscerate the finances of the French state. So there was no way that was going to be allowed. So how do you stop that? How do you stop a contagion bank run if you're not willing to turn on the liquidity? Well, you can't inflate. You can't devalue. You can't default. What's left? Squeeze. Welcome to austerity. It's all about saving the banks, folks. Always is. Now, along comes Draghi. What does Draghi do? Member states can't devalue or default, so they have to contract, unless the ECB finally decides to act like a central bank. And what you have here is the Italian 10-year. So this is basically Italian 10-year going up to 7%. 7% was regarded as the we really are now in trouble, warning, warning, Jim Robinson, we're all going to die signal, right? So you get up to there, and eventually in November of 2011, he dumps €1 trillion into the market. You can see the yields go down, but then they go back up because nobody really believes this is going to fix it. So he does the LTRO2, and he sticks another $500 billion in the market. That goes down, but it starts to come up again. The second circle, that's OMT, outright monetary transactions. That's the promise to buy bonds. Now, the minute you do that, all that contagion risk disappears. Because you've said to the market, we'll do what the Brits have done with QE. We'll do what the Fed has done with QE and TARP and a whole bunch of programs. We will actually backstop your bond market. And all the yields fell in their ass. At this point in time, the French 10-year is trading lower than the American 10-year because of short-term inflationary expectations. So if there was a banking crisis, all it needed was a central bank to step up and act like a central bank. You didn't need to do 2 years of austerity, 3 years of austerity. You didn't need to punish the periphery the way it was done. But we did. And that was actually quite tragic, because what you needed was a giant liquidity dump. And eventually we got it. Here's how much it cost. This is Oliver Wyman's internal consultancy report in 2013. Total state support and approved for the EU financial sector totals more than $5 trillion, equivalent to 40% of GDP. One question for you folks. Has anybody passed the vote on this? Has there actually been any democratic oversight of that much cash going out of European taxpayers' pockets to prop up the financial sector? The answer is no. Read the bottom line. Otherwise insolvent banks have been recapitalised, and the monetary policies of the ECB and national central banks have allowed themselves to do this at low cost. So what we have, in financial terms, is a class-specific put option. So how does that work? Well, imagine the following. When you bail out banks, you bail out people like me, because I'm old enough to have a pension, and I have assets, and I have shares, and a portfolio, and a house, and a mortgage, and all that shit. And the interesting thing is, you don't, and you're not going to get it either, because we've got it all, because we're greedy. And here's the thing. The bank's assets are my liabilities, and my assets are the bank's liabilities, and it all sums to zero. So my mortgage is a pain in the ass for me, but it's the bank's income stream. And I like having a house, and if I ever go bankrupt, which will never happen because I'm a professor, it's ridiculous, I shouldn't even have a retirement portfolio. But nonetheless, if I did go bankrupt, the bank doesn't want my condo, but they are other sides of the balance sheet for each other. Now, when you bail out banks, what you're really doing is you're bailing out the assets and incomes of the top 20% of the income distribution. Now, you've got to pay for that, because what you're doing is you're turning private sector debt into public sector debt. So what do you then do once you've turned, for example, Spanish debt to GDP from 26 to 96? What do you do when you turn Irish from basically, I think, net 16 to 86 to now over 100? Well, you got to make cuts, right? It's that terrible debt. We've been spending like drunken sailors. Well, who consumes government expenditure? The bottom 80%. So people like me have an implicit insurance contract on the rest of the taxpayers in society to bail out my assets when my risk takers get into trouble. That's actually what happened. But you'll never hear a politician talk about it that way, because it's the top 20% that ultimately counts. God, that sounds Marxist, doesn't it? Anyway, so if a banking crisis that was cured by backstopping the bond market was cured by backstopping the bond market, why would you keep doing this? And the answer lies back in the mysteries of time. This is John Locke, or apparently that's what somebody thinks John Locke looks like. Hang on a second. Yes, on time, good. So, have you ever read the Second Treatise of Government? Anybody? Hands up if you read the Second Treatise. Most of you are ignorant. Go away and read it immediately. So in the context of the English Revolution, when he was writing on the side of let's get rid of the king, the reason he was writing that stuff down wasn't because he had some fundamental concern with freedom and liberty, it's because he wanted to run the state. And why did he want to run the state? Because if you run the state, you can get rid of peasants. And if you can get rid of peasants, you can basically grow sheep. And if you can grow sheep, you can sell the wool to the Germans and get their silver, so you can get really rich. That's kind of what the whole deal with the enclosures was in the whole English Revolution. So basically, you need the state to make markets. You mean they're not given by God? I'm afraid not. So you need to basically enclose and have laws and create property and do all this sort of stuff. And when you do that, Locke knows, it's right in the book, that this generates massive levels of inequality. Now, if you're going to generate massive levels of inequality and dislocation, you're going to need someone to police those distributions. That would be the state. But here's the problem. If the state's strong enough to protect your assets, it's strong enough to steal them. This is why the Americans have the Second Amendment. It's written right in, it's hardwired into liberalism's DNA. And the problem is, if you need states to create markets and you need states to police the distributions the markets make and keep them stable, it's expensive. But given that the inequality skew is incredibly extreme if left unfettered and there's no redistribution, very few people will have to pay an enormous amount of tax to protect their assets. And they don't want to do that. So imagine if I could come up with an option on the future that would allow people at the top not to pay taxes. What's that called? Government debt. Are there any Italians in the room? Excellent. Why is Italian debt, why is Italy the 17th largest economy in the world and yet has the 3rd largest bond market in the world? I will answer that for you. That was a rhetorical question. There's the bit where you go, no, actually you can puzzle this out, right? Here's the question. Do Italians hate their state? Yes, with a vengeance, right? They're a bunch of shits, there's no doubt about it, right? So if you go down to the Council of Deputies, across the road from the piazza, there's a restaurant called Il Privilegenza. So imagine actually having a democratic house, and then you come across the road and there's a restaurant called the Privileged Ones, right? They hold people in utter contempt, right? So you don't want to pay those guys taxes, right? So what do? You lend them the money. 60% of Italian debt's domestically held. You will lend the bastards the money, and you'll get it back with interest, but you won't pay taxes. Very liberal of you, even though you're a bunch of Catholics. Now, this becomes an option on the future. But here's the problem. David Hume comes along, and in his essay on public debt and his other essay on money, both of which are worth reading, you have 3 of the foundational ideas of modern macroeconomics. The first one is the long-run neutrality of money. In the essay on money, he says, you should always give monies to the merchant classes. You should leave them in charge. They're better than kings, they're better than sovereigns. Why? Because we know what to do with the money. So our sinews of commerce are energized by giving the merchant classes money. But it's not a panacea. I mean, you'll get a short-term boost, but at the end of the day, it has to be put into productive assets. Hello, that's the long-run neutrality of money thesis. But it's class-specific. Now, he then says something else very interesting. So there's this thing called debt, and I like it, but I worry about it. It's nice to have a bond market, and basically people like me can invest in it. But in order to invest in it, I'd need to get equivalent, more or less, to the real rate of return of investing in real assets. Now, real assets are risky. Investing in a business, it's uncertainty, you don't know what's going to happen in the future. Government bonds, dead simple. They issue the currency, I then swap the currency for the option, they give me back the debt it's great, right? So this is easy money. Now, what happens if everybody decides to do easy money rather than hard investment? You crowd out the market. Welcome to the crowding out hypothesis. So once you crowd out the market, he's a wonderful phrase in this essay where he says, all of the gold and the silver that connect the sinews of commerce will be rushed out of the country. We will all end up in debt to ourselves and worse still to foreigners. The result is penury and death. So right there, this terrible fear of debt, right? But at the same time, I don't want to pay any taxes. So what's my option? My only option is to go with the option. Now, Adam Smith comes along. For those of you who read The Wealth of Nations, you know he's obsessed with parsimony, this notion that we're hardwired to save, which is really the grounding as to why savings equals investment, because it has to, because you would be mad if you didn't invest your capital stock. But he's also acutely aware of inequality, and there's a great line in The Wealth of Nations where he says, for every rich man there is 500 poor. And were it not for the firm hand of the civil magistrate, he would every night sleep insecure, as would be his investments. I mean, literally, could you say it more plainly? My favourite line from The Wealth of Nations is the following. Civil government, insofar it is instituted for the defence of the rich against the poor, or those who have property against those who do not. I put that down on tests for extra credit for my students, and 97% say Karl Marx. No, sorry, Adam Smith. He was honest. So what's his problem? His problem is back to the Lockean problem. I need this state, but I hate the state. I don't want to pay for the state, but if I don't pay for it, some bugger's going to come and steal all my stuff. So I'm in the horns of this dilemma. So I guess we're stuck with this kind of option called debt. We're just going to have to do this. But what about taxation? And in Book 4 of The Wealth of Nations, Smith comes along and says, hang on a minute. Maybe those with the biggest stake in society should pay the most taxes. Those who get the most gains should pay the most taxes. Progressive taxation. And Smith is rightly famous for that. What he's not famous for is what comes next. Because if you read to the end of that section, he basically says, bugger that. I'm not paying all that because it's just me and a handful of my mates. So he quickly reverses course and goes for a proposition which is the core proposition of the modern American Republican Party. Let's have a national consumption tax. Let's get rid of income tax completely and have a tax on consumption. Well, that's terrible because poor people consume more, etc., etc. Yeah, but you know what his real problem is? It just won't raise enough money. So I guess we're stuck with debt. And that's it. And eventually we'll end up in more and more debt and the country will go bankrupt. And by the Napoleonic Wars, Britain had 200% debt to GDP. And they spent a century paying it off. But you know what helped? Imperialism. You know what else helped? Quintupling the size of the economy, so that by the 1860s you were down into reasonable double digits. So growth cured debt. Britain didn't die of debt, despite all of the rhetoric and all of the prognostications. When you get to the 19th century, this story takes an interesting turn. Who's that on the left? David Ricardo. Pretty chap, isn't he? Who's that on the right? John Stuart Mill. Not a pretty chap. Which just goes to show you that right-wingers are better looking because they have more money. Now, oh, come on, it's a joke, lighten up. What do you get in Ricardo? If you read Ricardo, apart from getting a headache, what you read when you read Ricardo is a very self-calibrating system, whereby firms are driven into what he calls the common rate of profits. So the rational thing to do is to adopt technology and shed labor. And the only way you can keep your profits is if you move constantly into new markets, which is why he was actually interested in international economics. He thought that profits would always devolve to a common rate. In such a world, any attempt by the government to basically redistribute is just basically the maladjustment of capital. And it's just going to make things worse, so don't even try. So my favorite line from Ricardo is, the condition of the poor is wretched and rightly so. It takes some balls to say that, but it's in there if you want to find it. Now, along comes Mill about 30 years later. The country's richer, the debt is lower, it's growing faster. And the new liberalism says, well, hang on a minute. We're going to get into trouble here. I mean, we're past 1848. Did you see all those revolutions that nearly happened in Europe? They will come and burn your house down. Maybe we should redistribute, and maybe that would actually be good for stability and consumption. And there's a thing called the suffrage coming down the turnpike, and these guys are all going to vote our property away from us. So let's get ahead of the curve and try and redistribute and keep the liberal settlement, albeit with airbags. Now, this all comes together in the Great Depression, where liquidation was the answer. Who is this on the left? It is not Nosferatu. Who is it? That's Joseph Schumpeter, and he actually looked like that. So he was, apart from the Austrian finance minister who used to turn up with the 2 most expensive prostitutes in Vienna to every cabinet meeting just to piss off his guys, the other guys in the cabinet, a flamboyant lad. His autobiography says he wanted to be 3 things in this world: the world's greatest lover, the world's greatest horseman, and the world's greatest economist. ... Sadly, I only managed 2. Please. So anyway, what did he associate with? American academic economics in the 1920s is very much, if you've studied real business cycle theories, it's new wine in old bottles, because they had back in the 1920s modern business cycle theory. And what does it say? Well, basically, the capital stock's exogenous. There's no such thing as money in finance except credit booms. People malinvest because of credit, because banks need to be kept tightly under control. Very sort of von Mises Austrian sort of line. And when you get these credit booms, people build too much capital upstream in sort of productive industries that will never realize value downstream, so the only thing you can do is liquidate the capital. So this is very much the way that Americans think about this. So 1931, Treasury Secretary Mellon has a famous line that's quoted in Hoover's memoirs, where he says, liquidate the farms, liquidate labor, liquidate business, purge the rottenness from the system, and more competent people will come along and pick up the pieces, right? So this is the don't intervene, let it all bleed out version, right? Now, the Brits had their own version of this, and of course the Brits basically are less vulgar than the Americans. So they had the Treasury view. And again, if you want an example of how the frames that we use today are really just recalibrations of the frames you had before, look no further. So 2 guys, Henderson and somebody you've heard of called Keynes, wrote this memo to the Treasury that made a case for expansionary public works to cure the fact that Britain was on too high a real exchange rate when it rejoined the gold standard, and there was 1 million unemployed they didn't need to be. So maybe we can boost the underlying level of GDP, would be the way we think about it now. The arguments that the British government put up were brilliant. The first one was crowding out. If there was investment and the government mobilized it, then it's less investment for the private sector, so why would you even bother? So that's that one. The second one, public spending. If I know that you're going to basically not tax me now to boost spending in the future, then ultimately you're going to have to raise taxes in the future to pay for that, so it becomes self-cancelling. Realizing that, I should change my consumption patterns to nullify the effect. It's called Ricardian equivalence. It's written in the memo. And the last one, this is the one that was hung all over the Obama stimulus, there's no suitable public works. There's nothing shovel-ready, as they said when Obama did the stimulus. Now, if any of you have ever been to the United Kingdom, the notion that the United Kingdom does not need serious infrastructure investment at any point in its history. This is a country that can't figure out complex technology like windows, showers, roads. I mean, it's kind of pathetic. So clearly there's a flaw in that one. Now, this is, to me, the key insight of macroeconomics. What's individually rational can be simultaneously, collectively disastrous. So that little panel there shows you basically the German economy through time in terms of the unemployment rate and then the share of the Nazi vote. So in 1924, you managed to get the swap in seniority in war credits between commercial credits and war credits. So commercial credits take seniority. Immediately what happens is there's a big shock to the system. The unemployment rate goes up, but then it comes down once this filters through. Everything's going reasonably well. Unemployment's creeping up again. Look how slow the Nazi vote is. But then we get to 29, 31, you get the failure of Credit Anstalt, you get the Chancellor Brüning coming to power in the SPD, and then you get tighten. And what you see is a rocketing of the Nazi vote going up. Now, this is one story. Odd thing is, if you look at Japan, you get a version of the same story. If you look at France, in the history of France between 30 and 36, before the Popular Front, a very similar story. What you have is a politics, excuse me, of creditors standing off against debtors. And in that international politics and in the domestic politics which replicates this, it's basically the extremes that win and the centre collapses. Now, echoing this today, have a look at the share of centre-left parties' votes over the past 12 years. Have a look at just what happened to Labour with Corbyn. And then think about in France, if you had an election tomorrow, it's entirely possible that who would be the #1 party after the first round? That's what happens when you get credit or debtor standoffs in a deflation. Now, the 1980s come along, and this was very fun for economists because a bunch of them, particularly in Bocconi and Milan, decided that the opposite was true, that you could do contractions that would be expansionary. So in other words, you know, we'll all discount and we'll go to IKEA and we'll cure it before it happens. So the cases that they highlighted were Denmark, Sweden, Canada, Ireland, Australia. And this became very, very sort of topical in economics because it seemed that these countries cut and then they grew, right? But the funny thing is, once you actually go into it, and I spend a lot of time in the book going into it, and I'm not the only one who's done this, that's not what happened. So take the Scandinavian cases. All of these countries, first of all, are really small in global terms. They're all export driven, and they all have one key trading partner, whether it's the UK, whether it's the US, or whether it's bloc EU. And when those big blocks go on a tear and expand, they import more. So if you're a small country and you time this right and you basically do a devaluation, the other block goes on a tear and sucks in your exports, your revenues go through the roof. And when your revenues go through the roof, what can you do? You can cut spending. But in real terms, you're not cutting spending. It's only a nominal cut. That's what all these countries did. They grew, and they grew enough to allow them to cut. They didn't cut and then grow. But that was not fitting the narrative that we wanted at that point in time. Now, this was all kind of harmless economics until the Euro crisis hits. Because when you can't inflate and you can't devalue, and the only thing you can do is squeeze, you need a rationale for squeezing. And that was the rationale for squeezing. And this is the June 2010 ECB report that outlines everything that you need to know about the initial response to the Euro crisis. It has an entire chapter on Ricardian equivalence. It has an entire paragraph or two on crowding out. All of those ideas that I highlighted to you, they're all in there. Just pick it up. I think it's chapter 5 and chapter 6. And it basically outlines the Troika and conditionality packages, the structure of bailouts. They should be based upon cuts rather than taxes. And it says that simultaneous contractions, even in a low interest rate environment, will not be contractionary. They will be expansionary because of the effect on confidence. So here's the fun bit. Let's work out how this worked out. So think about this as an investment proposition. What's your return on equity if you were to basically buy that argument and invest in contractions in 2008? Well, the funny thing is, it doesn't look so good. And the really funny one is, let's have a look at who comes out first. So the line that's there first, the one that comes out before anybody else, is Belgium. Are there any Belgians here? There must be one Belgian in there. Statistically, there must be one. No? Okay, fine. Well, so you haven't heard much about the Belgian austerity package, have you? Because there wasn't one. You haven't heard about the Belgian fiscal expansion package either, because there wasn't one. In fact, Belgium didn't have a government between 2008 and 2010, which meant no one was around to screw things up, which is pretty much why they bounced back before anybody else. I'm not being facetious. I actually really believe this. The second one, of course, is Germany, and of course that's because they make things the rest of the world wants. As the owner of a TDI diesel Volkswagen, I'd like to say, fuck you. But they still make stuff that people want. In fact, we've got 2 of them, so I'm doubly pissed. But nonetheless, why are they able to bounce back? Well, because they live and die off of exports. And who just did a giant stimulus? America and China, the people who buy your BMWs. So that's perfectly explicable. Who's next? Good God, it's France. They didn't even have such a terrible downturn in comparison to everyone else. It's sclerotic, immobile, unentrepreneurial, cretinous France. I've been reading the Financial Times for about 20 years, and every 6 months you can set your clock by the fact that there's a 3-page special issue on why France is doomed. I don't know why Anglos do this, but they have to convince themselves that basically making an actual labor-leisure trade-off must end up in economic suicide. They just don't get it, right? That's basically it. But there it is. You know, you got your problems, hiring, firing, micro stuff, absolutely. But you're still growing. Now, who else is there? Who comes out next? Who's the last one? Oh, the UK. Well, that's easy. You basically put your financial sector back together with bigger air bubbles, and you intermediate rest of the world capital flows as if your economy is a giant hedge fund. That's pretty much what the Brits do. And where is everyone else? They're still stuck in the shite. So it really hasn't worked out too well when you think about it. And have a look at Greece. They've lost 30% of GDP, and their debt has, in real terms, doubled, despite cutting all that. But Europe is on the mend, so it must have worked. Spain is now growing at 3.1%. As you can see, Portugal is growing at 1.5%. Even sclerotic old France grew at 1%. The euro area as a whole managed 1%, and Even Italy managed 0.5%. You haven't grown since the minute you joined the euro, and you finally got one. You know, there's a clue in that. You haven't grown at all since they joined the euro. I mean, I'm just saying, right? So anyway, problem solved, right? Well, maybe. See, the Bank of Spain report in July said that the drivers of the Spanish recovery were basically import collapse. In other words, people haven't got any money to buy imports. Cheap oil and quantitative easing effects. 69% of Spanish workers under 25 are on temporary zero-hour contracts. And think about the knock-on effects onto that, onto credit markets, right? So we're booming again. We're growing, right? I've got a job. Let's go get a car so I can go to work. Great. Can I see your employment contract? No, I don't have one. Oh, there's a bummer. So how do you restore your credit markets when basically you can't give loans to people because they have shitty contracts, right? So all these little micro things that are going on, youth unemployment still incredibly high, etc. So what's the thing going forward? The first thing going forward is structural reforms. You hear a lot about that. And the second one's a shift to exports. So let's do a quick straw poll amongst the economists here, right? Would you agree with the following sentence? The economy, particularly on a global level, which we all live in these days, is a giant complex adaptive system which is horribly nonlinear with hidden convexities, partially visible generators, and it's just unbelievably complex. Would you say that that's true? Hands up if you think that's a reasonable approximation of the world. I'll go yes. You don't have to join me, but I'll go yes, right? Most academic economists would actually admit it and say, yeah, that's kind of true. Which begs the question why the hell they're doing equilibrium modeling, but that's a different story. But anyway, right, put that over there. Now, if that's the case, this is a rationale for not doing interventions. Because if the world's horribly non-linear, the notion that you can intervene at time X with policy Y and get result Z becomes really dubious, right? But the weird thing is, we say that about macro policy, hence the rationale for not doing fiscal policy. But nobody says that about structural reforms. And structural reforms basically assume a complete homogeneity of institutional types across economies. So that all labour markets are the same, all capital markets are the same. And there's a checklist of things that you do that will improve efficiency. Now, the problem with this is there's well-known results in economics. There's two of them I mentioned here, Lipsey and Lancaster's second best, and the Schonenstein-Mantel-de theorem that basically says you can aggregate demand functions and they don't actually aggregate. Basically, you can't get from one equilibrium to another because what happens is it's an all or nothing move. And every time you try and improve something, you create nonlinearities that push you in another direction. So you're trying to get to an impossible point. Now, these are well-known results that everybody ignores because they're uncomfortable. But even the empirical work on structural reforms, Gauti Egerson's recent piece on this, basically shows that if you do this on the ZLB in the middle of a recession, guess what? It adds to the contraction. And you might get good effects, but you might get effects years out. So a good example of this, again, if you were Brits, you would know this one, but allow me to fill in the details. So back in the 1980s, one of the things that the Thatcher government did was massive amount of structural reform. You beat up on the trade unions, you create more flexible markets, blah, blah, blah. And guess what? They've had horrible wage stagnation like everybody else has because Labour has no bargaining power. But more interestingly, they deregulated their financial sector. Now, the rationale for this was British industry was starved of funds. And British industry wasn't on the ropes because of shitty management relations and low investment and crappy products and they can't figure out what a window is. It's because they didn't have good capital markets. So if we have good capital markets, people will invest, these firms will become world beaters. And they deregulated finance. And what happened? Finance basically did a leveraged buyout on the husk of British industry and destroyed it and ate it for lunch and turned the whole place into a financial entrepot that has debt to GDP internally in the financial sector of 450%. Now, that's seriously non-linear, folks. That wasn't meant to happen. So why are we so sure that the structural reform agenda, as advertised, will have the effects that we hope? So if it doesn't, the way we're going to get out of this is basically through the macroeconomic counterpart, which is Donald Rumsfeld. That's the bit where you're meant to go, what the fuck? No? Okay, remember him? No, you're all too young. Donald Rumsfeld was the Secretary of Defense during the time when America decided to invade enemy of the month number 17, who at that point was called Iraq. And he said when he wasn't getting the support that he needed from France, boo, hiss, that there was an old Europe and a new Europe, and he was interested in the new Europe, not the old Europe. Well, you know what? He's right, but not about war. He's right about exports. So here's a funny little factoid. Last quarter, the Eurozone as a whole ran a trade surplus against the rest of the world. Means that as a whole, the Eurozone is exporting more than it's importing. But look at those numbers. 26.4 billion, but 24 billion of that comes out of Germany. Now, Germany's 30% of the Eurozone, but they're not 3 times more efficient than everybody else. So how can Germany possibly be 90% of the variance? Well, the answer is this. Have a look at the supply chain. So have a look at the Czech Republic. 1/3 of the Czech Republic's exports go straight into Germany. 1/3 of that third is one category of exports: vehicle parts and body part supplies for the auto complex. Run through all of those countries. That's the new supply chain for the German auto complex that sells me diesels that lie to me. But they're very good cars and everybody buys them. So these guys are going to be great off this system because they never had big welfare states. They're not Sweden. They're post-communist societies that implicitly trust markets and distrust the state. And basically they have a lot of skilled, relatively young labor that's mobile, and investment rates are very, very high there because they don't have trade union protections and all the stuff that you've got here in France. And they're making money hand over fist. So as far as they're concerned, everything's fine. Now, remember the Greek crisis in the summer? Who were the first countries out to tell the Greeks that they were worth nothing? There's your list. Now, turn the other side round on this one. Let's imagine that you've got a line you can draw from Finland down to Alto Adige, out to Romania, back up through Austria, through Poland, and that's export-led Europe. It's running a surplus against the rest of the world. What does France do? What does Italy do? You see, they're very different types of capitalism. These are large consumption-led economies. They're not export-led demand economies. So imagine you've signed something called the Fiscal Compact that says that you've got to run a balanced budget, and one part of the currency zone is running an export surplus against the rest of the world. Homework assignment for your international monetary economics class. Go through the identities in the national account and figure out what's got to happen. They've got to run a contractionary policy domestically to offset the surplus. So what you're basically saying is France is going to have to run a near permanent austerity budget the more that Germany and Eastern Europe exports to the rest of the world. Ouch. That doesn't sound like a solution to me. I've got some charts I won't bore you with because they look ugly, but basically what they show is for the Czech Republic and Hungary, these guys have rebuilt their capital stock, they're exporting, the Germans are importing their stuff and it's going out into the rest of the world. So what does all this mean? Eastern Europe is to run chronic deficits, now they're all running surpluses. They've integrated into the German supply chain, they've rebuilt their capital stocks, and that's now active. So the key question is this secular or structural? We've seen this story before. Have you ever heard of the East Asian financial crisis? All those countries ran deficits, chronic capital importers. And then they went bang in 1997 and they said, we are never going to go back to the IMF, we're going to build up gigantic surpluses to make sure we don't have to. And they did. And now they run structural surpluses against the rest of the world. And now we're trying the same trick. Whoops. Because that can only work if somebody's importing. Now, if 2/3 of the world economy is exporting and 1/3 is importing, what's that 1/3 called? The United States of America. So unless you guys are willing to basically be dollar long infinity and intermediate American short-term and long-term paper forever, which is the best deal we could ever hope for in the United States. Because ultimately what it means is you're selling me BMWs and I'm giving you bits of paper yielding 1%. That's the deal you're setting ourselves up for. Then this is inherently unstable. Second one, as I said, who can play this game? France can't play this game. Doesn't work. It's not because you're bad, it's because you're a different variety of capitalism. The regulation school guys in France nailed this 40 years ago. There are different regimes of accumulation, different institutional varieties of capitalism, and it matters. If you're an export-led economy, you can play the German game. If you're not, you can't. You can try and turn yourself into one, but there'll be blood on the streets before that happens. Third one, bond market effects. Basically, if you have this world in which you have near deflation everywhere, and everybody's trying to run an export surplus and is over-saving, that surplus of saving over investment's got to show up in long bond rates. So the Fed can do what it wants on the short end of the curve, but the long run is low forever. If you've got substitutable low assets and negative real rates, it's very, very hard to get growth going, even if you're running an export surplus. And the last one is fragility. What happens if people stop buying your stuff? You got a problem. So the take home on all this is the following. The anti-austerity position has never been, you will never grow again. It's always been, do this and you will permanently lower your growth track. You will do enough damage to the demand side that you can change the supply side and screw up your politics. That's still true. You can continue to tighten, but if you want to try and do structural reforms and you're doing it in the middle of a recession, it will work out really badly. Intellectually, we're hardwired to do this and to discount evidence to the contrary, because we basically have half a dozen ideas we constantly go back to. We just reframe them in different ways, usually with more mathematics. And ultimately, if France has been asked to run a permanent, basically contractionary policy, so that Eastern Europe and Germany can run a surplus, that's going to be more dangerous for the EU than the election of Le Pen over the long run. So, I'm Scottish. I think this way. I drink a lot. Cheers.